Soft rain threads itself through the canopy, each drop a tiny percussion on the great green roof of Catachan. Listen to it, a patient, steady tapping that falls and fades, that gathers into the hush between heartbeats. Beneath that steady pulse, the jungle breathes, long inhales of humid air, slow exhalations that carry the scent of wet earth and something older, something mineral and sap-rich, the kind of smell that tells you the ground remembers every footfall it has ever taken. Close your eyes for a moment and allow the sound to smooth the edges of thought. Let the leaves whisper become a lullaby. From above, the world is a vast swath of emerald and iron. Trees roll into one another like waves, their crowns knitting a living ocean that shifts with the wind. Rivers thread through that ocean, veins of mercury and black glass, catching and rejecting the light of a sun that is often shy behind curtains of cloud. These rivers do not simply flow. They hesitate, gather themselves into pools that watch you when you pass. Mist collects in hollows and drifts like a curious thing with no hurry at all. And the rain is the jungle's constant voice. It speaks in soft syllables and in sudden, sharp punctuation, in the quick staccato of a downpour that erases paths and names. This is the surface image, the one the Imperial atlases show if they show Catachan at all. A green world of abundance and peril, a backwater whose coordinates are mentioned in dispatches with a careful, tired shrug. At the edge of Imperial space, Catachan sits like an old scar on the galaxy's skin, distant, half forgotten, alive in ways the Administratum cannot legislate, where other planets have been remade into monuments, into cities of stone and light. This world has remained stubbornly itself, a place where life insists, where each fragile organism claws meaning from a soil that wants to take it back. There is no grand architecture here, no polished spires or hymn-filled cathedrals. The architecture is green and wet and dangerous, and the worship that takes place is small and private. Children learning how to still their breath, women teaching hands to move like knives, old men remembering traps they used to set when snakes were younger. It is easy to romanticize rugged worlds, brave men and women standing at the edge of civilization, faces creased by wind, voices raw from chanting the emperor's name. But Catachan's romance is a hard thing. Here, survival is not a story told for glory. It is a slow, practical art. People do not go out to the river to fish and whistle. They go because the river is a ledger and they must pay what it asks. Children are taught to move with the jungle's rhythm before they learn to read the sky. They learn which plants will bind a wound and which will make the wound worse. They learn the weight of silence. That silence here can be a trap as easily as sound. If you stand too long with your thoughts audible, the jungle will answer, and sometimes it answers with teeth. And from that life, sharpened by necessity, grows the Catachan Jungle Fighters. They are not soldiers in the sense the Mechanicus dreams of. They are not clean, ordered instruments. They are the country's bone and marrow. Men and women whose bodies hold the map of their planet in scars and calluses, whose reflexes are carved by the constant apprenticeship to danger. When they move, they carry a history in their posture. The way a shoulder bends to the weight of a las gun, the small tilt of the head that listens for the wrong kind of silence. They are taught to sleep with one eye open in their skulls, to walk on the edge of sleep, so that waking is not a shock but a continuation of alertness. They know how to make a shelter from woven vines and how to use a skull as a signal. They learn to read the small signs, a spider's web severed in a way that means a foot has passed, a ring of flattened grass that means a predator has rested. Those lessons are delivered like prayers, quietly, by those who have lived long enough to be patient teachers. The Catachan fighters are not uniform in the way an Adeptus Astartes might be. Instead, they are a collage of patched uniforms, scars, and stamped meanings. A veteran's bandana, a child's toy las pistol mended into a sidearm, a braided length of rope that once was a friend's hair. Their language is short and practiced. Their laughs are bursts that come out of play rather than relief. They have a particular sense of humor that is sharp and quick and often cruel, because cruelty softens the fear for a moment. When they gather at night, huddled beneath canopies heavy with rain, they share stories of traps walked and beasts outwitted, and they pass on small, necessary superstitions, to never whistle two notes in a row, lest a thing that follows melodies answer. Above all, they respect the jungle. Not worshipfully, their respect is practical. The acknowledgement that the forest gives and takes in equal measure, and that tomorrow's living depends on today's prudence. Listen closely, and you will hear that the jungle sings in many registers. There is the high, continuous choir of insects that are at once cheerful and relentless. It is a sound that, after long exposure, sinks into the mind like a slow hum behind the skull. There is the distant thunder that can start like a bass note in the earth, a reminder of storms that move faster than men. And then there is the low hiss of predators that are never exactly at the edge of sight. The thing that moves and does not rustle in the way a deer does because its body has evolved cunning, and the sound of silence. These sounds provide the Catachans with the music of their home, a score they have learned to anticipate and to manipulate. They listen to the jungle because if one day they stopped listening, the jungle would rearrange them. A typical morning on Catachan begins before the light does. Not with bright discipline, but with a quiet house song. The lightest footfalls that scare small creatures from the perimeter of camp, the soft closing of lids on sleeping stores, the tug of ropes that keep hammocks from sagging. The first light is not golden but green filtered, as if the sun itself sees the world through the leaves. Shadows here are layered. A shadow of a shadow might be the only clear space a human has to move within. Food is gathered or traded at the margins. Tubers dug from clay that clings to fingers like memory, small meat smoked beneath leaves, water boiled until it tastes of iron and the faintest ghost of moss. People examine each other's wakefulness the way sailors might check a ship's hull. A slow blink can mean a fever. A cough can mean something worse. To be part of the jungle fighters is to know that even ordinary morning routines are notes in a long symphony of vigilance. They train as much with their hands as with their minds. Physical conditioning is unsparing, scaling roots that are wet as eels, lifting loads that are heavy with the water weight of the world. But it is not only strength that matters. Precision does too. A Catachan soldier must be able to thread a strand through a throat of a vine without waking the plant, to patch a wound with the gentlest pull so the flesh will knit rather than harden with scar tissue that will slow them later. They practice in the hush, where a misstep is punished by the sudden absence of a friend. Instruction is often tacit, a glance, a shift of weight, a movement in the leaves that becomes shorthand for more complicated commands. In their training, they learn to think as the jungle thinks, to regard obstacles not as metaphysical problems, but as physical puzzles with solutions waiting for hands that know how to find them. It is important to remember that Catachan is not only a crucible of danger, it is a place that composes people in its image. The best of its children come back from missions with a certain economy of motion and a smile that has been taught to hide. They are capable of tenderness, the way a veteran might soothe a frightened recruit's hand, the way a parent might hum a lullaby that smells faintly of charred meat. But tenderness is always measured. Their love is practical. Food stored for a neighbor's child, a rope thrown across a ravine, the sharing of the single cigarette in the lee of a boulder. In the slow hours, in the lean light between storms, laughter bubbles up the same way sap might, sticky, surprising, and nourishing. Those moments are rare and treasured, given as proof against the grinding indifference of the environment. And yet the planet holds its own tempo that is not always understandable to those who live within it. There are ecological rhythms to Catachan that occur over years, over generations. Certain flowers bloom only after a particular pattern of rain. Certain insects swell in numbers when one particular fungus reaches the density of a cloud. Trees shift subtly from being sources of shelter to being threats as they trigger fruiting bodies that attract predators. There are places on the map that old men will not cross, and they will not say why. They only shake their heads, spit into the mud, and cross themselves in a tiny ritual that means, in the minimal language of survival, do not go there. Those interdictions are part of the culture, woven into maps that are more oral than written. Young recruits learn these maps as they learn to spit, to not rope, to breathe through dense, biting air. The Catachan Jungle Fighters are called upon not because they love war, in truth, many of them do not, but because their bodies and minds are already adapted to the chaos of a world that refuses to be disciplined. In the Imperium's wars, where mechanized columns and starborn fleets claim planets like territories of a game, the Catachans are the necessary counterweight. Specialists in survival in conditions others think impassable, able to harvest victory from the very things that would otherwise devour an army. They are called brutal, and sometimes that reputation is earned, but it is cruelty shaped by a different ethic, not the worship of violence, but the worship of staying alive. They kill to live, and they live to be ready to kill when required. It is a grim calculus, but it is honest. If you listen to the veterans as they smoke beneath the canopy, you will hear the way they speak of those they have lost with a particular intimacy. Names are not discarded. They are folded into metaphors and back into the rhythm of the jungle's song. A man who died under a falling strangler vine will be remembered in the way recruits lean under similar vines. The memory, a practice more than a story. A woman who fell to a silent predator will be remembered in the pattern of hunting formations, the gap in the line replaced by a new stance to cover it. There are rituals that are private and not always recognizably religious. The passing of a blade, the planting of a sapling in the place where the fallen rested last, small acts that bind the living to those who no longer walk among them. And there are other presences here too, ones that even the Catachans move around respectfully, if only because they are efficient at avoiding things that kill. Some elders will speak of the old world before the current one. They will tell of great storms that rearranged geography, of rains that fell for months and washed away entire histories. Some will tell of the stones that hum beneath certain moons, of the vines that tangle with what might be metal, of the bones that are both animal and, disturbingly, not. These are stories kept in the low firelight, not told to frighten, but to instruct. They are the conditional sentences of a culture that knows the world can change its rules without consulting anyone. The young listen with a curious mixture of skepticism and hunger. The old watch their faces for the moment when instruction starts to look like belief. On Catachan, superstition and survival are braided together to such an extent that it can be hard to tell where one stops and the other begins. It is in this braided space, practical skill bound to whispered story, courage bound to caution, that the fighters of Catachan are forged. They become to the Imperium what a sharp tool is to a craftsman, necessary, shaped by use, not ornamental. When they are sent beyond their planet's rainforest, whether in defense of an outlying world or as the edge of a larger assault, they carry the jungle with them, not only in their scars and their small rituals, but in a way of seeing. The world is a place of potential concealment and sudden revelation, of ambush and retreat, of leaves that can hide teeth and roots that can snag a boot. Off-world they are sometimes misunderstood. They drink too quickly, they sleep oddly, their laughter comes sharp and sometimes cruel. But ask any of them in quiet, and they will tell you that the jungle is their teacher and their mirror. It is also the measure by which they will judge all battles to come. As dusk swallows the light and the rain starts its slow applause once more, picture a small camp. Lanterns lit with oil that smells faintly of resin sit in shallow rings. A child curls under a blanket that carries the scent of moss. A veteran runs a palm over the blade of a knife until it sings, and someone hums a tune that is older than the names they give it. All these sounds form one whole, a living, breathing chorus that fills the space between waves of insect song and the distant lowing of thunder. There is comfort here, but it is a comfort leavened by the practiced posture of alertness, a readiness that has been taught into muscles and into the tone of a voice. And yet, if you allow your attention to widen, to drift outward along the river like one of the small, bright insects that hang above its surface. You will sense something else beyond the practicalities of habit and survival. There is a patient intelligence in the world's slow movements, a pattern that sometimes looks less like randomness and more like intention. The trees bend in ways that are not always explained by wind. Roots appear where yesterday there was only shallow soil. Certain songs, hummed at the edge of camp, seem to answer with a rustle from far off. Elders say this is the planet's way of being itself. Young ones half believe it and half smile, because a story that keeps you alive is worth believing. But there is a slight thread of unease, a tremor that runs beneath the campfires and that follows veterans as they patrol the borders at night. It is not fear so much as a respectful attention, an awareness that the world's laws are not entirely theirs to command. So we end this first slow chapter with the smallest of warnings, spoken not to alarm but to prepare. The rain will keep falling, the leaves will continue to murmur, and the rivers will remember every footstep. The Catachan Jungle Fighters will rise each morning and meet the world on its own terms, with skill, with laughter, with ritual, and with a kind of quiet ferocity that is the product of history and necessity. But remember, too, that this is a place of living things that have known time without the arithmetic of human calendars. For that reason, the simplest mortal certainty, that sleep brings rest, is an uneasy supposition here. They call themselves children of the green, and it is not an empty phrase. To be Catachan is first to be of a place, not merely born there, but shaped by it in the slow, insistent way water shapes stone. That shaping is visible, in shoulders bowed by carrying water across a ravine, in fingers that knot rope without thinking, in eyes that read shadow as readily as other folk read faces. It is audible, too, in the way their laughter cracks like a dry twig and in the cadence of their speech, clipped from necessity. For those who grow up in the jungle, there is an education that begins before anyone teaches them the alphabet. They learn the names of plants in the same breath that they learn to count, and they learn the cost of a bad choice by watching a neighbor not come home. Children on Catachan are not wrapped in cotton. They are wrapped in knowledge, how to move silently through wet leaves, how to skim a poisonous vine with the flat of a hand without taking its sting, how to sleep lightly with a laspistol within reach, and a sharpened sapling over the doorway to catch a falling branch. They become small cartographers of risk. They learn to know the sound a particular branch makes when it bears a bitter fruit versus when it hides a nest that should be left alone. They learn the particular rhythm of rain that precedes a predator's hunt. These are practical teachings passed down in the dark under canopy evenings, while parents stitch boots and trade gossip, and the children stoke a small, smoky fire. There is no sentimentality attached, only a quiet, fierce practicality. To survive on Catachan is to accept that danger is a teacher and that the lessons are relentless. From these early lessons, the Catachan Jungle Fighters are grown rather than made. They are not a program of drilling and bright banners. They are a sum of bones, training, and the unromantic habits of long practice. Their uniforms are more patchwork than parade, stitched together from memories of tools and throats saved. Their boots are thick and scuffed. Their weapons are maintained with almost ritual attention, not because of a doctrine of maintenance, but because a weapon that fails in the mud can mean a funeral. There is an economy to everything. Food is cut to the right size to share, fire kept to the exact strength necessary, conversation held in soft tones. Efficiency here is not military polish. It is a cultural refinement of scarcity. You see that in the way a Catachan tucks a small packet of powdered root into a folded bandage. That bandage will be kept until the last useful thread frays. The Imperium delights in ready myths. For the administratum and its devotional pamphleteers, the Catachans are heroic caricatures. Feral warriors who leap from the green and rend Xenos with tooth and claw. A romantic footnote in the grand chronicles of war. Statues get made, songs are trimmed to tidy heroics, and officers from civilized worlds speak fondly when they must recruit the jungle bred. But the Catachans themselves treat those legends with a weary indulgence. To them, survival is not theater, it's instinct, something that exists below thought. Many of their young do not grow up dreaming of glory. They grow up dreaming of enough water for next season, of a roof that does not leak in 2 storms, of a child who will not wake at night with nightmares of teeth in the dark. When an outsider spins tales about heroes of the green, the typical Catachan simply grins and sharpens a blade. If they have time, they will tell the outsider the truth in spare terms. The jungle gives and the jungle takes, and that name hero is expensive and often inaccurate. There is pride in that economy, but it is a hard pride. Pride is not a lover. It is a tool that keeps you moving. You see it in the way an old soldier will straighten to tie a knot he taught a boy once. In the way he will keep that knot taut though his hands tremble with age. You see it in the tenderness that is practical and immediate. The way a comrade will wipe mud from another's face in the middle of a march. The way the last biscuit is broken into precisely equal pieces. The Catachans measure worth in usefulness. A man who cannot sew or move silently is of less value in the green. A woman who can find clean water in a month of drought is of high value. This may sound utilitarian, but there is warmth in it, a calculus of care born from the knowledge that, if you do not sustain those around you, none of you will survive long enough to tell stories. Into this life comes Sergeant Mara Voss. If the Catachans are forged by the world, Mara is one of its more weathered tools, a body that looks as if it has been polished by rain and the hands of many strangers, a face crisscrossed with lines that map more than age. Those lines map decisions, those tiny folded debts you see only in veterans. She walks with a gait that suggests both readiness and the comfortable assumption that the world will move as it has always moved. Her hair is cropped close, braids hang at the nape of her neck like talismans. Her armor is less imposing than those of other regiments, worn, fitted, and patched with the marks of many repairs. A las pistol hangs at her hip, a blade is at her thigh, and there is always a spool of cord within reach. She moves as if she is listening to the jungle even when her ears are closed, and her silence is not emptiness but a presence. Mara's reverence for her home is quiet and particular. She does not kneel to trees or speak in hushed tones filled with awe. Her reverence is expressed in the small acts of obedience that a person gives to a thing they understand. The way she avoids stepping on certain mosses because the elders taught her that they mark a trap. The small blessing she murmurs when a cup of clean water is found for a child. She can tell by the feel of a vine whether it is old enough to serve as rope or too young and sap-laden to bear weight. She knows the names of the insects that augur storms and the small birds that will lead you to safe ground. This knowledge gives her an intimacy with the world that is almost familial, not warm in the comfortable sense, but a deep, practical kinship rooted in survival and respect. At the same time, Mara carries a shadow that she cannot name. It is not the common, rational unease of someone who has fought. It is subtler. It sits in the slight tilt of her head when she listens to the woods, and in a dream silence she has had since childhood, a memory so old she cannot locate its source. There are nights, she admits to no one, when the cadence of insect songs seems to bend around something else, like a voice that wants to speak but is being careful not to be heard. She catches herself pausing in patrol lines as if waiting for an answer to a question no one asked. This quiet unease does not make her less capable. If anything, it sharpens her. Yet it is there, a frayed thread of awareness that makes Mara more attentive than she would otherwise be, and less likely to leave an anomaly unexplored. You can imagine Mara as she prepares for an off-world deployment. Such departures are common. The Imperium's hunger for soldiers is insatiable, and the Catachans are often sent as specialists in clearance and survival. She packs with the same economy that defines her life. A handful of tins, the best knife she possesses, spare ammo wrapped in oiled cloth, a small packet of the bitter root that staunches bleeding. She packs a photograph folded into a strip of oilcloth, not of a lover or a child, but of a particular bend of river where she learned to swim as a child. She touches the photograph with a thumb that has known 100 knots. Her comrades joke, rough and quick, about battles to come. Their laughter is sharp as flint. Mara smiles in return, but there is a gravity in the smile. She knows what leaving means. It is not always a return. She has women and men in her memory who did not come back, whose names are marked on small wood discs hammered into the trunks that line her village's perimeter. When she speaks of duty, it is because she believes it. Duty, for Mara, is a practical concept. It is the exchange that ensures the survival of others. The Imperium's rhetoric of glory and honor does not intoxicate her. She has seen glory, and it is messy and expensive. Friends who die with praise on their lips and insects that gather at the edge of a field where blood has spilt for weeks. She has no taste for the poet's idea of heroism. Instead, she measures success by rate of return. How many hands come back to the cookfire? How many children have been fed this month? How many traps have been turned so that fewer will step on them tomorrow? This practicality does not make her unfeeling. It simply allows affection to be allocated in ways that keep most alive. Because Mara has lived long in a dangerous environment, superstition and ritual sit next to her rational acts like companions on a long march. She keeps a small charm at the base of her neck, a smooth stone etched in a child's handwriting, a gift from a niece. It is a token without obvious power, but she accepts its comfort. Before sleep, she will sometimes trace the scar along her forearm made by a serpent's tooth and whisper a name she learned in childhood, a syllable that has lost clear meaning, but serves as a rhythm to push away the less rigorous kinds of fear. These rituals are not theocracy. They are instruments of focus. They sharpen attention in the same way a blade is honed until it glints, and that clarity is what has kept her alive in moments when raw strength would have failed. In the trainings Mara runs, she does not merely instruct. She translates the jungle to those who are less fluent. She is patient with recruits who cannot yet hear the minute differences in leaf rustle or the subsonic click of a predatory mandible. She is less patient with complacency. The drills are brutal because the world is brutal. Practice in crossing spider-netted glades, in extracting a spear from a lung without succumbing to shock, in reading the trail of an animal that moves as if it has rhythm rather than direction. Mara's methods have a rhythm and economy to them, a sequence of motions repeated until the body takes over and the mind is free for observation. She is a teacher in the old way of Catachan, a way that trusts apprenticeship more than doctrine, an example more than theory. Despite their hardened edges, the Catachans are not without humor, and Mara is often the pivot of it. Her jokes are dry, almost arid, and delivered with impeccable timing. Where outsiders might flinch, she has a laugh that breaks tension like a stick snapping. It is a humanizing thing to watch. In the aftermath of a clean but bloodless successful trap, she will offer a quip, and a young recruit will grin like a sunburst. There is joy here, but it is compact and functional. Joy is celebrated because it is brief. It is a necessary heat to ward off a slow, creeping cold. In those moments, Mara's reverence for home is at its lightest. She will sit and trade small stories with her comrades, describing a childhood prank or a hunting success. And in those stories, the planet becomes soft for a moment, less a hazard and more a community. And still the jungle presses its own presence into the margins. It is not brutal in an even sense. Its cruelty is often peculiar, calibrated, as if it has preferences. Occasionally, in the middle of what should be ordinary work, an oddity arrests Mara's attention. A patch of ground will sink a fraction of an inch with a sound like breath. A series of stones will be arranged in a way that mimics a face anyone could mistake for casual arrangement, but which radiates a carefulness that suggests intent. In better weather, language itself seems to stretch. Cicada's regular chirr morphs into something that sounds like layered whispers, a texture that pricks the skin. These moments are small and would be easy to dismiss were they not repeated across time, across different eyes. The elders don't always speak of them plainly. They prefer implication and coded warning. They will tell simpler stories to the young, to avoid a certain marsh, to not whistle two notes on the same night. But the older ones, those who have seen storms that shifted rivers overnight, have a different look in their eyes when the topic comes up. A distracted, wary look that suggests at least the possibility of something in the world that does not follow expected rules. It is in the small, accumulated oddities that subtle unease first climbs. Let the listener imagine a patrol at dusk. The click of a last gun safety is a small, reassuring punctuation. The device makes a sound, deliberate, metallic, and a soldier's hand will often rest on it as if to confirm that metal and doctrine still have primacy over life and instinct. The cicadas pump out their rhythms, but on some nights their collective song stretches and slides until it is less chorus and more texture. The patrol walks over ground that seems, at the worst moments, to have a breath beneath it. The soil gives just a fraction of an inch, like the drawn-in breath of something sleeping just under the root, and then it settles again. A dying campfire will crackle, sending small, comforting sparks into the night, but the crackle itself can sometimes be heard overlaid with another sound, a distant, not quite human rasp. It has no object. It is not an animal, at least as anyone can name one. These are the first hints, quiet and easily swallowed by rational explanation. A shift in soil might be an underground critter tunneling. A weird arrangement of stones could be the careless work of river debris. The cicada's song might simply have been carried by wind in a way that made it seem altered. Catachans are survivors. They are trained to prefer the reasonable explanation because it costs less in fear and keeps the group functional. Yet even reason can be forced to look sideways when patterns persist. If over years the same place yields the same unsettled smallness, then instinct begins to reframe itself. Warnings shift from crisp and tactical to an old Catachan's slow, elliptical lament. We don't touch that bit. Not since the night the old river took 3 men and gave them back as twisted roots. The story is told in low voices, and eyes flicker toward the dark corridor of the jungle. Mara knows these stories. She has them tucked between the folds of her practical memory, and she treats them as notes rather than doctrine. She will not cross a marsh that the elders avoid. She will not dismiss a recruit's unease if it carries a certain sharpness. Still, she is a soldier first and a superstitious elder second. When she hears of a strange phenomenon that threatens a mission, she sizes it up part instinct, part cold calculus. The question is always the same. Is it manageable, and if so, how? She will map contingencies and rehearse them until every man in her squad knows the steps by muscle. It is this balance of practical leadership and cautious deference to the environment that makes her respected and followed. So the life of the Catachan fighters is a layering of early learning, of fierce practicality, of pride that is not given lightly, of laughter shaded by the knowledge of cost. It is lived in the texture of weathered leather and oiled weapons, in the small ceremonies that pass on names and protect against forgetfulness, in the way a veteran will teach a recruit to treat the jungle as a complicated relative, loved, scolded, kept at a certain distance. Mara Voss carries all this with her as if it were a map stitched into her skin. She is proud, and she is somber because she understands what her people have already paid for each day of living. And even with that knowledge, the trades of survival, the refined skills, the iron economy of feeling, a thought remains in the back of many minds on Catachan. You can feel it as a ripple when a patrol pauses, as a tightening of breath around a fire. It is a tiny, insistent discomfort, almost a curiosity at first, then something more. The trees moved sometimes, not in the wind, just moved. The soil seemed to breathe underfoot. Alaskan safety clicked cleanly in Mara's hand. The sound was a small promise. Cicadas continued. Their song became a layered whisper that wanted to be heard. The crackle of the dying campfire threw a long orange finger into the night, and nothing answered it that should have. These are the moments the Catachans carry quietly, like a folded letter addressed to no one in particular. and they teach their children to fold it the same way. Mist laid over the ground like old silk, folding itself into hollows and trailing along the path, as if pretending it had a reason to be there. The night was not quite complete. The moon was a smudge behind a veil of cloud, and overhead the canopy stitched itself into one dark tapestry where stars might once have been. Boots sank. Each step took a small portion of the world and buried it under the rhythm of marching feet. Soft squelches, the dull slap of leather on moss, the careful, practiced cadence that turns a group of hunters into a single, moving organism. The sound was steady enough to be soothing if you listened the right way, a primitive metronome that kept the mind from wandering into things it did not yet understand. Fog collected at knee-height first, then rose, thin and deliberate, brushing the legs of the marchers as if to test their balance. It smelled faintly of iron and crushed green, old blood in the soil, the bitterness of vines, the resinous tang of leaves that refused to let go. Overhead, branches interlaced like hands at prayer. Around them, little lives hummed their routines. The world looked for a time like the inside of a dream, familiar shapes flattened into texture, edges softened by the rain's slow fingering. The regiment moved through that dimness with a practiced hush. Lanterns were curtain close. Torchlight was a traitor. Eyes were trained to pick out anomalies in shadow. A leaf that hung wrongly, a spider web severed in an unusual arc, the ghost of a footprint that suggested weight but not direction. Mara walked at the center of the file, her silhouette a small, unshowy thing among many. She felt the march more than she looked at it, each muscle in tune with the ground's complaints. Her last pistol was snug at her hip, the click of its safety, a small, frequent reassurance that she pressed into her palm as if to feel the world's ordinariness. There was a map of the planet in her bones, where the mud ate boots faster, where the vines grew sullen and heavy, where the river's current reversed itself in a strange, local way during certain storms. She had read those maps since childhood. Tonight she read them again, fingers tracing invisible seams as she moved. Patrols were not adventures here. They were slow, methodical conversations between human bodies and a living surface. The squad moved with a choreography softened by years of practice. Scouts fanned ahead, shadow-thin figures that paused like listening birds. The heavy columns, pack-bearers and supply tenders, kept to the center, their steps a deliberate anchor for the line. Voices were whispers folded into the wind. A trainee's breath came a touch too loud once, and Mara's hand shifted in his direction. A single, silent correction that tightened the young man's shoulders into the proper humility. Overhead, the cicadas worked at their steady, minute-long complaints, and somewhere far off a thunderhead rolled low, promising rain that would come later and rearrange the world again. At first, the jungle gave them no more than the expected quirks. A branch that seemed to curl a millimeter away from a passing shoulder. Vines that would slacken as though embarrassed to touch skin. Soldiers joked about it in the private language of people who avoid talking about fear. The humor was thin and useful. Jerk, a lean man with a habit of chewing his lip, blamed the formations on the mice that lived in the bottle brush, while Tessa swore the vines were shy and needed coaxing. They laughed and the sound folded into the forest and was accepted as one more small offering. Then, subtlety unrolled into pattern. It began with a single, small absence. A scout named Rook, who had gone ahead to test a narrow trail, did not answer the second roll call. Rook was a spare man in the squad's accounting. His absence could be folded into 1,000 reasonable explanations. He could have found a shallow ravine and lost the path. He could have gone to relieve himself and been slower on his return. Mara paused the line as if pausing to breathe. The men behind her folded into the halt with the practiced silence of veterans. Lanterns were dimmed to oblong pools of darkness. Mara's voice, when she spoke, held the usual flatness of command. "Wait," she said, and the word was an anchor. They sent a pair of scouts back the way Rook had taken, light steps retracing his track. The patrol watched the fog as if it were a thing that might reveal a hidden truth. It did, eventually, in the way fog will reveal a shape already present. There was a disturbance in the leaf litter where a boot had passed, imperfect, the edges pulled up and then settled. It suggested that someone had knelt there, perhaps tied a slipknot or let a pack rest for a moment. They found the strap of a satchel abandoned on a root, rope frayed as if chewed or ripped. But there was no rook, no personal scent caught on the strap, no blood. Mara crouched, feeling with gloved fingers the ground's texture. The soil was cool, and for a moment she thought she felt a faint give, like the inhalation of something breathing under the earth. She told herself that was nonsense. Roots shift, soil compresses under weight, wrong-footed animals burrow. She mapped rational possibilities. Her hand stayed on the earth another second longer than she meant it to. The world was still the world, she said inside her head. The jungle has its tricks. They called a cautious search, moving in tighter circles, the squad becoming a small spindle of light sweeping the surrounding green. Rook's track vanished where the moss was thickest, a place where the ground had been scoured by something larger than men. There were shreds of cloth clinging to exposed root, the edge of a glove wedged like a small white flag in a knothole. Equipment was present in fragments, a canteen lid, a strip of fabric, a boot that was upside down as if kicked free. Each artifact suggested an exit but not an ending. There was no blood. There were no drag marks, no lately soaked footprints leading away. The jungle had swallowed what should have been visible and had given back only the impression of absence. Mara's rational mind assembled possibilities one by one and dismissed them for being either too implausible or too violent. Maybe Rook had been taken by a predator that left no trace. Maybe there was a pit covered by herb that collapsed. Maybe he was testing them, a poor morale exercise. The last possibility she discarded almost immediately. Rook was not that kind of man. She barked orders in measured tones. Search methodically, mark the edges, widen the sweep. Each order came in the practiced dialect of 100 nights of patrol. Her voice, however calm, had an edge she could not entirely smooth. The men listened because they were trained to listen. Under the surface of their obedience, a current that had nothing to do with command moved. The animal knowledge that quiet things can be the most dangerous. They found a second absence 3 nights later. This time it was quiet old Nella, who often walked with a limp, someone who had taught recruits how to find boiled root when supply lines were thin. She had left the camp to check a snare at dusk and not returned. The search found her pack-sling shredded like paper, a trace of fingernail on a vine that suggested a desperate grab, a bit of hair that clung to sap and a smell, an iron-tinged musk that was not quite blood. Again, no body. Again, no clear tracks leading away. The absence accumulated. Where once the patrols moved through the green like steady metronomes, now there was a hollowing beat, a gap that could not be explained away by rain or fungus. Rumors began to gather the way fog accumulates in a hollow, not loud at first, but persistent. The veterans muttered about old places that should be left alone. Someone suggested the patrol captain from a neighboring company had once trapped a monstrous tree that closed upon men. An elder's story about the ground breathing in a sleepy way made the round and was eaten politely. The younger soldiers joked about ghosts, because to offer a ghost as an explanation is less terrifying than thinking the world had simply learned a new appetite. They held fast to the rational structures that preserved sanity, the doctrine of weapons training, the matrix of tactical contingencies. Yet as each plausible explanation began to feel narrower, the men's voices slid in their throats. They began to hum to themselves, tiny songs of reassurance, a human counterpoint to the insect choir. Between vanishings, the jungle made its small, intimate assertions. Vines tightened when a sleeve brushed them, closing like fingers might when touching something living and shy. Branches rearranged themselves in the moon's weak light, parting so a traveler could pass easily, then closing minutes later as if saying the passage was meant to be private. Water climbed small inclines in slow capillary ascents, moving in ways that defied the simple grade of the land. Mara watched that once and thought at first that she had been mistaken about the slope. But the water kept rising, a little mote of a current crawling upward along a route, and she felt an old, unnameable unease. Her training offered explanations: capillary action, underground pressure, a microcurrent, but the image lodged, water going uphill not as an error but as an act. There were nights when the canopy itself seemed to draw breath. Soldiers in the watch would say the trees inhaled and exhaled, a slow movement in their trunks that could be measured if you sat very still. A man named Havel, who sang in a low bass when he was drunk, swore he could feel a pulse in the earth, a throb beneath his boots like a distant heart. The men laughed when he said it, deep, practical laughter that didn't entirely hide the tremor at the back of their throats. The more pragmatic explanations were always invoked: seismic trickles, the settling of roots. But as these occurrences multiplied, even pragmatism found itself stretched thin at the seams. On a patrol 3 days after Nella's disappearance, they found more sinister evidence. The first sign was the smell, not the sharp ferrous tang of blood, but a heavy, vegetable rot that sat in the air and suggested something had been opened and left to stall. Following the scent yielded a small hollow among giant roots where the ground had been scoured as if something had been turned inside out. Clothing fragments were woven into moss like fishing nets. A pair of gloves were caught on a stick that had been thrust through them and then absorbed into the wood as if the stick had a hunger to keep what it had taken. There were no drag marks. There were no bodies. The items suggested a kind of tidy hunger that took tools and left emptiness. When Mara's men called out at the fringes of that hollow, the jungle answered in the kind of thin rustle that could be mistaken for a bird or a small mammal. The sound was deliberate and oddly amused. It entertained itself on the edge of noise. For a long second the squad stood in place, listening to the plant life's mockery, their breath small and steady. Then Mara's voice moved through them, slow, a cord pulled taut. "Mark it," she said. "We stand watch here, 2-hour rotation. No one goes alone." The words were practical, but an inner coil tightened. She felt the repetition of names in her head: Rook, Nella, like beads threaded on a string. The command was a form of control, a way to make chaos obey the discipline of form. As nights lengthened, the patrol's routine ossified into rituals meant to ward against the small, patient intelligence they were starting to see. Stakes were driven around camps with particular geometry recommended by an elder. Fires were kept from bright to smoldering. Bright light, they thought, invited attention. They hummed while they ate, a low, communal noise that helped them locate one another in dense fog. Yet these rituals brought no absolution. The jungle shifted its tempo in ways that made the routines seem quaint. There were evenings when the very camp seemed to move a fraction of an inch, a slight rearrangement of twigs and leaves that made tents tilt in a subtle, synchronizing arc. The men took it as a matter to note and postpone worrying about, as if postponement was the most efficient survival strategy. On one such night, just after the rain had come and the rations were damp, the patrol recorded the smallest of clues that would later be described, in odd, half-credible retellings, as monstrous in its simplicity. A sentry called out that her Vox had picked up a repeat. At first, they thought it was local interference, old machinery on the far side of a ridge, a dying speaker in some outlying camp, but the pattern returned. A thin fragment of syllable, half her earlier order, echoing seconds after she spoke. Mara heard it herself, quiet and clear, the same intonation she had used to instruct a young recruit to hold his line. The Vox replied with the same phrase, perfectly timed, as if an invisible mouth were mimicking the sound at a fraction of a second's delay. "Hold line," the radio chuckled back to them. They tested it, asking questions, speaking orders. Their own words came back to them with a hesitation that was worse than ignorance, a precise, mocking mimicry that seemed too intent to be coincidental. Mara tried to catalog plausible technical failures. Vox units could latch onto each other and feed back. Atmospheric phenomenon could refract radio waves, bouncing them on currents that made echoes. But this device was not random noise. It was a reflection with intention, a second voice calibrated exactly to their own inflections. The mimicry was not perfect. It could not carry laughter or the full texture of human range, but it carried command syllables and names in a way that suggested comprehension rather than accident. More unnerving was the pattern. The repetitions came most often after instructions that pertained to movement or presence. A command to halt would be echoed softly, a fraction of a measure later. An order to step right would return in a way that suggested a slight, personal mockery of the command's authority. It was as if the world had taken to pronouncing their own language back at them, a mirrored tongue that spoke obedience yet returned unease. The psychological wear of these echoes was cumulative. Soldiers reported sleeping poorly and waking with a sense of being observed from inside their helmets. The quiet that had once been a companion now felt like an audience. Mara noticed young men snapping at imagined rustles, older veterans staring at nothing with a kind of tight concentration that made Mara's chest tight. She held a tacit conversation with herself. Keep them focused, make them accountable, hold the line of work and rhythm until the world is boring again. But the line looked wire-thin now. The repeating vox echoes were small things that reshaped perception, an audition of agency beneath the trees' indifferent attention. On a patrol where the mist had taken on a silver sheen, and the low fog made the world seem to wobble by inches, the squad encountered what would be the most discomforting of all the small signs. They found tracks that reversed, footprints they could read with a practiced eye-suggested movement inward, then a curling back as if the traveler had been drawn to a point, and then pulled away abruptly. The heel and toe of the prints scrambled into an impossible pattern. Alongside those prints were impressions that looked almost like fingerprints pressed into mud, delicate whorls made by many small appendages, rather than a single human soul. The pattern suggested not just theft but an intelligence that played with impression, that rearranged evidence as if it were a game. Mara crouched and put her face close to the mud, inhaling the damp sharpness. "Look," she said softly, pointing. No one answered. They simply watched with the attention taught by countless nights. Her mind offered the catalogs she had been trained on, animal tracks overprinted by rutting roots, the marks of old floods, but each offered less of a comfort. The mud told a different story. That things here could choose to show themselves in parts, like a storyteller revealing a tale piece by piece. The squad cleaned their boots and pressed the prints into memory, notches in the practical ledger of their experience. Yet each new oddity rearranged the ledger. They were learning that not every hazard could be rehearsed away. The whispers through the vox grew narrower and more cunning. They began to repeat in the cadence of someone who had learned the edges of their language. Mara gave an order, hold formation, and a rasping hint came back over the unit. Hold formation, breathed with a slight, insect-like intonation. It did not sound like a man or a machine. It sounded like something that had learned to sample and mimic. On nights like that, Mara's voice had to be a tempered instrument, precise and deliberate so as not to call upon the echo in half-formed ways. She felt watched and listened to in ways that had nothing to do with the enemy's rifle sights. It was as if the jungle itself had discovered that it could be interlocutor, parody, and judge. As the patrol continued its slow war with uncertainty, the men began to mark their movement in small, private compensations. They tied strips of cloth at eye level in ways that made navigation easier when fog thickened. They kept knives unsheathed. They chose to march in tighter files, smaller targets for whatever the jungle's intention might be. Mara instructed the men in a cadence of stances and responses. If a man vanished, they did not chase. They set the perimeter and mobilized the controlled search. Those instructions felt like rules in a game whose stakes none of them liked. They moved to the rhythm of those rules, yet every step was a prayer that the rules would still hold. The living jungle shaped them in other ways as well. Small things, how their boots sloshed, the way their breaths fogged in the mist, began to seem notable in themselves, as if the environment had turned them into objects for its attention. Mara sometimes would stop and listen to the subtle background thrum beneath the soil, a humming that had the qualities of both insect chorus and machine vibration. The hum was low, almost respectful, like the bass under a song that carried the melody but did not sing it itself. It had cadence and pattern, and on some nights it lined up with the faint echoing of their own voices. It was not a sound any of them had instruments to measure. It was a felt thing, like temperature or hunger, a bodily perception that made the skin prickle. By the time the patrol returned to camp, the routine of duty had been altered. Their small sanctuaries, the ring of stakes, the watched perimeters, had proven to be temporary hedges against a world that had quietly learned to step around fences. The vanishings and the echoes had not escalated into open attack. They had instead taken a subtler, more unnerving course. They had turned the everyday into an interlocutor. The men ate with their eyes up, listening to sprigs of sound, feeling the hum beneath their boots as an approximated presence. They slept in shifts with a nervous, efficient rotation. At the edge of dreaming, when the mind becomes porous, the mimicked orders sometimes arrived again, breathed into the dark like a lullaby gone wrong. Mara lay awake a long time that night, listening to the rain begin to fall on the hood of the shelter, and mapping the names of the missing against the slow beat of practice that kept their world from rolling away. She thought about Rook and Nella and the others, their faces now interleaved with the pattern of the jungle. She tried to hold to logic, predators, sinkholes, human error, but she felt a new hypothesis forming in her bones, one she had not wanted to name aloud. A possibility that Catachan's green had a memory and a will, and that somehow it had learned, no, chosen to rearrange. The thought pricked like a nettle. It was not yet terror. It was an unsettled attention. Outside the shelter, the wind carried the click of a lasgun safety in its thin, metallic way, someone's small, habitual reassurance. And the cicadas stitched their small, continuous music. Beneath these sounds, a faint echo came over Mara's own vox. Her voice, quiet and calm, corrected formation, the syllables falling back upon her like a shadow. She let them sit in the air, measured them against the tap of rain. For now she kept the edge of her mind razor-sharp and her orders exact, and that was how they would proceed. The jungle had begun to speak. She had not yet learned its vocabulary. The line between listening and speaking had narrowed until it felt like a blade. They would move forward tomorrow because that is what soldiers do. They would map, mark, and mark again. They would practice the rituals of survival and try to leave the rest unremarked. Yet somewhere under the skin of all those small acts, there flowed an anxious question. What happens to a people when the ground they have learned to obey begins to answer? The jungle stopped being merely a place of hazard and became an active force that breathed purpose into everything it touched. Where once the patrol had moved like a unit through indifferent green, the green began to act with intent. At first it was a small, almost flirtatious attentiveness, a fern that uncurled just as a hand came near, a vine that seemed to warm and relax when a soldier leaned against it. The novelty dulled into unease. Then the jungle sharpened. By the time the change became incontrovertible, the regiment had already paid a price measured in absences. The missing men were no longer singular incidents to be folded into training anomalies. Their loss hung between the living like a cold, damp cloth. The green that had been a background to life and work flexed and turned, showing tendons and patience. It did not attack with claws and fangs so much as it coaxed and rearranged, and that rearrangement grew hungrier with each night. In the deeper red of dusk, flowers cracked open and revealed not petals but delicate, wet orbs like sockets. They blinked. Tendrils that had looked like small fingers in wind lengthened into something like eyelids. Pollen puffed like breath and settled on helmets, on lips, on eyelashes. And there was a moment when the men who inhaled it felt memory, ancestral, impossible, stain the edges of their minds. The blossoms watched. They did so with patient curiosity, like children learning to name the faces of strangers. Roots, once predictable knots of strength, began a nauseous mimicry of life. They pulsed underfoot with a slow, midnight heartbeat, flexing as if an internal circulation moved through wood and rot. The ground itself seemed vascular. Veins of darker soil rose and fell, webbing across the trail like the map of a living lung. Sometimes the roots would brush a boot and withdraw in a motion that can only be called shy. At other times, they would press up and leave an imprint like a palm print in clay, as if the planet were stamping its attention into the record of their passage. Men's bodies answered to the green in ways that were at first subtle, and then alarmingly plain. A rash that had been dismissed as an insect bite spread in a neat, almost decorative pattern, its pigmentation deepening until the skin in some places took on the luster of new bark. A recruit named Hask felt a thin, tendinous protrusion under his collarbone and joked about getting a souvenir. By the time dawn came, the tendril had darkened and quivered with independent motion. More than once a soldier would wake with the sensation of something moving under the surface of his skin, a slow peristalsis like a worm making its hours known. Veins, once pale through sweat and exertion, turned to a darker, near-ink color, the network below the skin visible like a mapped river. Men flexed hand and arm and watched their skin ripple with small, halting growths. Where armor pressed, the flesh below would sometimes bulge as if an unseen hand were pushing from within. The talk of the camp in those hours had less of the practical stoicism that had held the regiment together in past troubles. It had the tremor of people trying to place too large feelings into the narrow slots of habit. Mara listened to her men in the hush before dawn and found their voices rougher, like broken chords in a song they thought they knew. The whispers of worry multiplied. Rituals thickened. The men began to wrap extra bindings around limbs that showed odd discolorations, as if the confinement might slow whatever the green was etching into flesh. They took to rubbing bitter root into the skin, sought old cures, traded incantations and stitches in whispered barter. Yet the green answered in its own language, patient, insistent, and slow as tide. The whispers through vox were no longer occasional mimicry, but a steady chorus. It was not just the cadence of the men's voices returned. It was the shape of words that had been taught for years to mean one thing, order, prayer, obedience, that began arriving back with a different intention. On a humid night when the rain had stopped but left every surface pulsing wet, Mara issued a call to assemble the line. Her voice was deliberate, the syllables clipped and functional. The vox returned her phrase a breath later, but the echo had a weight to it that the original lacked. The tone had flattened into something else, something almost ritual like a prayer read from a stone. "Hold formation," Mara said. "Hold," the chorus whispered back, elongating the syllable into a sigh that felt like reverence. At first she thought of me-synced equipment, of radio ghosts cavorting in the ionosphere. But when the echoes began to add small additions, breath sounds like whispered punctuation, a drawn-out consonant that had the cadence of benediction, she felt the hairs along her neck stand up for reasons that had nothing to do with electricity. The men themselves began to hear, between words, fragments that suggested cadences of prayer. The Empire's liturgy, taught to them in barracks and on marches, bled into the jungle's voice like pigment into water. What had once been commands became softened into invitations. Join the earth, be reborn. A suggestion that sounded less like propaganda and more like a kindness offered to the tired and broken. It is a peculiar cruelty when an invader or predator mimics your language, because mimicry presumes understanding and, with it, the illusion of empathy. Here, empathy became bait. The jungle's refrain folded itself into the register of trust, until it was no longer easy to tell whether a remembered phrase belonged to the man who had voiced it, or to the green that sang it back. Men who had once declared their loyalty to the Emperor in ironclad certainty found themselves lingering at the edges of the phrase. The latter syllable sweetened into a lullaby that suggested surrender as salvation. Mara's internal life, which had long been a quiet ledger of duty and small mercies, began to add a new entry: doubt. That doubt was not the kind bred of cowardice. It was the philosophical unease of someone who could see two coherent explanations and could not force one to obsolesce. On one hand, the green could be simply what she had always known it to be: fierce, insistent, and adaptive. On the other hand, there was an uglier possibility that the world itself had exceeded the boundaries of natural selection and had taken up a hunger the Imperium's reports did not account for. Had Catachan always been these things in quiet, or had the devastation of war, the constant flow of blood and metal, the carrion of conflict, given it a new taste and a new appetite? Perhaps this was punishment for countless worlds that had been bled dry for the throne's wars, a planet learning to turn the commodity of men into nourishment. The thought offended but lingered, a coal warmed in the chest. The squad's nightmares reasserted themselves in waking hours. One soldier, Ren, who had once been a gentle, talkative man, suddenly grew silent and kept to his hammock, humming under breath. He awoke one morning with his palms slick, and a thin green filament lashed across the webbing between his fingers. He had borne the filament like a curse for an hour before he took a knife, and with hands that trembled, cut at it. The filament split like the bark of a wet reed, and slipped away with a tiny, wet sound, dissolving into the soil as though it had been only a leftover of moss. That night Ren groaned in his sleep, and woke with a fresh, narrow wound along his forearm that bled a dark sap instead of bright blood. When he peeled back the ragged edges of the cut, half in a fevered attempt at explanation, half in a kind of macabre study, his comrades saw and found a thing not entirely explainable. A thin, vine-like appendage writhed inside his flesh, pale and translucent, moving with a deliberate, patient rhythm as if searching for anchorage. Ren screamed, an animal sound so immediate and raw it stopped the small conversations around him, and his mates, with hands that had once been used to patch armor and stitch tendons, moved with forced calmness to remove it. They cut, and the vine was stubborn. It lodged under tissue like a parasite that had recruited the host as both home and altar. When they cut away and pulled, fragments resisted, and the wound contracted around the thing that had once been living on the forest floor. Blood, when it came, ran thin and dark and smelled faintly of loam and decay. For days Ren's vein-work would show hints of woodgrain beneath the skin, a network that could be seen and traced like a map. He recovered, insofar as a man recovered in such circumstances, but the recovery was not a return to the pristine. Something had changed in his marrow, in the way his hand flexed, in the way his stare lingered on root and bank. The vine had not been simply excised. A lesson had been left behind. The squad dwindled. The attrition was not the simple arithmetic of mortal combat where bodies are struck and fall in plain sight. It was a stealthy subtraction. A man would trail his hand on a particular trunk, and then step away with a smile like a man who has remembered a private, funny thing. He would wander off with the explanation that he wanted to find a cache of water. He would pause to investigate a singing bloom, and when called, fail to answer. Sometimes there would be an echo of his voice, a delayed reply on the radio that sounded like a fond mockery. By the time the squad rocks to collect the missing, they would find a glove's worth of evidence and no person, a boot folded inward like a leaf, a knife embedded in a trunk, a torn scrap of uniform lashed to a thorn. The green took what it wanted with a neatness that made men think of metaphysical agency rather than random hazard. Sometimes they found men who had not been taken but had become something else, walking, and yet no longer merely human. A corporal named Sade once returned to the camp, after a long absence, looking as if he had spent a season embedded in sunlight and root. His hair was braided in a way that suggested vines, small green shoots woven into the plate. His voice was quieter, and his eyes had developed thin, black lines at the corners, like the shadowed hollows of seed pockets. He spoke of dreams in which the jungle sang to him, and of a particular tree that had told him how to find water in the driest season. The men cheered his return at first, but later they noticed he did not eat meat as he once had. He tasted leaves in his stew and seemed to find them sweet. He sat at the edge of the group and hummed the same slow lilt the flowers had taken to humming when they were content. There was a silence around him, half curiosity, half irritated fear, as if they were neighbors who had discovered that the man they once trusted had a new, odd habit. Mara watched these conversions with a custody that bordered on despair. Every person who changed became for her both symbol and sorrow. She found herself cataloging the differences, like a doctor writing down symptoms. Where had the contagion come from? How did the green teach living tissue to forget its category? She devised tests, containment of plants, scorched perimeters, trials of salt and fire. But each method yielded only partial results. The green either shrugged them off or folded itself deeper into what fire could not touch. It learned by exposure and adapted by subtle means. When salt burned a leaf, the plant would close and then produce a new shoot that grew with small, salt-hardened edges. When a perimeter of scorched earth was laid, the jungle began to throw seeds across it like a carpet until the scar was green again. It was as if every attempt to enforce a boundary taught the planet a lesson in boundary breaching. There were nights when the whispers turned precise in their call. The voice, if it could be called that, would coax. It would offer a tired man the image of a river so cool his pain would be washed away, or a song that promised a reunion with the faces of mothers long dead. It would imitate voices known intimately to the listener, mothers, wives, dead friends, and offer the chosen indulgence of the soul as a toll. The mockery turned tender. Men who could no longer keep their wits would slip lines that led away into gullies where water seemed to go uphill, and where roots curled like arms ready to take. Mara found, in the charred remains of a camp where a sergeant had disappeared, a single boot placed carefully at the mouth of a hollow, as if whoever had vanished had set a marker like an offering. The thought of men arranging their own absence as gift stung the regiment like a betrayal. Mara's own body began to register the planet's insistence. Where once she had touched that assessed wood and rope with casual acuity, now she found the spaces between leaf and bark looked like invitations. She resented the way part of her wanted to answer back to the lullaby the green hummed in the dead of night. She fought a war of attention, focus on ration counts, on patrol patterns, on the names of men who were still missing. But one night, in the fog of exhaustion where the mind is a thin thing, she dreamed of the heartwood, a mythic trunk that elders whispered about, and awoke with the peculiar sense that her lungs had been drawn more shallow by sympathy. On some days she felt her reflection in waters stain a green tint, a trick of light perhaps, and on others she would run her hand over a scar and feel, for an instant, a throb like the pulse of a vine through the muscle beneath. Amid this obsessive atmosphere came the hardest tests for any leader, decisions about what to push back against and what to let be. Mara held councils at the edge of maps, hands rubbing a spot on her knee where a knot of scar tissue had been a map mark for survival. Officers argued for aggressive cleansing, for controlled burn lines, and the use of incendiaries designed to sterilize zones where men had vanished. Others urged caution. An indiscriminate flame could just as easily claim the lives of men already lost or warp the land into something yet more alien. They debated the ethics of scorched earth in a place where scorched earth equated to the death of delicate ecosystems, an argument of theory that tasted thin in the mouths of hunger and loss. The decision fell back to pragmatic calculation. Preserve the living and try to take a chunk of the jungle away from the green so that it could not learn to anticipate their moves. They marked lines with petrol and prepared for a purge. They burned. The fire they set was not great. It was a controlled ribbon of flame meant to cauterize a path along a ridge and create a buffer. The night the fire swallowed the understory, the heat felt like a finalist's test, a crucible held under the sky. For a time it seemed to answer, a clean edge made by human will. The regiment watched as the green recoiled in burnt singe and smoke. For a day they sauntered in an almost gullible relief, imagining the jungle as if cowed. But the green did not retreat forever. It learned. In the places where the fire had been most aggressive, new shoots later sprang with odd armor-like ridges, thicker leaves that held ash in the veins. Seeds learned a soil smoke taste and sprouted with an aggressive, thorny hunger. The burned line became a wound the jungle could use to lengthen its reach. The attrition in numbers accelerated after the fire. Where once men had been missing in ones and twos, now the squad's count diminished by whole knots in a night. They would wake to find a man's hammock empty, as if he had slid out like a snake, a small etching of his name in the bark where he had once perched, or a pivot of leaves arranged into the rough shape of a human hand, as though the world had mocked their absence. Those taken left behind artifacts of slow intention, a belt laid over a root like an offering, a helmet placed upon a stump and polished by unknown hands, footprints that arced inward and then dissolved like a script that stopped mid-sentence. When Mara stood at the last edge of camp on the night where only half her squad remained, the jungle felt like a living tribunal. The heartbeats of the remaining men were audible as one in the hush, a stitched thudding that matched the pulsing underfoot. In the canopy, the flowers blinked and turned toward them as if to measure their fruit. The whispers were no longer teasing, nor even invitations, they were decisions. Join the earth, they breathed, not as command but promise. The men's minds were fragile. The green offered a resolution to all fatigue and grief. It promised a return to the soil, to the cover where pain could be metabolized into growth. Those who left did so in small, private ways. Some walked in circles until they were alone, and then followed a sound no one else could hear. Mara could not catch them all, and in the long calculus of leadership, she could not stop the lure of something that offered rest when the world was otherwise naked with need. There was no epic last stand. There were only fragments. A man who wandered into a glade where the trees made a hollow like a chair, and then sat for a very long time, smiling as if listening to a long-remembered song. Another who ran his hands along a series of trunks and seemed to dissolve into their grain with a shuddering pleasure. In each disappearance, the green closed a door and left a memory like a coin. The men who stayed, those who could not or would not succumb, worked with a kind of ferocity that felt like grief given shape. Mara organized patrols that were smaller and smarter. She taught techniques of countersensory discipline, ways to avoid calling back the jungle with laughter or accidental song, ways to keep their speech clipped and utilitarian. They marked their perimeters not with bright signals but with dull knives and the quiet knowledge that sometimes the best deterrent is dullness itself. In the final weeks of the campaign, the squad that had once been 30 dwindled to a handful who moved like old ghosts. Hawk with his slow, deliberate steps and his eyes that never trusted shadow. Lyra with the small mantras she muttered over stitchwork. Mara herself, who had the look of someone whose ledger held too many missing names. They navigated by old markings, by the brittle memory of perimeters burned into the soil, and by listening to the hum under the feet that now sometimes lined up unnervingly with their own pulse. The jungle had taught them a grammar of loss that was precise and tender, and it had a certain justice in its cold economy. The land fed on what the land could take, and what it could not take it made into something else. One night, the kind of night where fog rolled like a low sea and the stars were smudges, Mara stood in the center of the ridge and listened. The breathing of the jungle was a chorus now, and it hummed in intervals like the sounds of a song. For a long while she stood there, arms crossed against the damp, feeling small as a fallen leaf. Her mind kept returning to history, and to the possibility that the planet was a kind of vengeful ledger for the Imperium's wars. Was this the world's reprisal, a slow reclamation of those who had come as conquerors and left as trophies? Or was Catachan simply doing what life had always done, finding novel ways to persist in a universe that prizes exploitation? The two possibilities coexisted, each sharpening the other in her chest. When the last of the squad walked away, Hawk deciding that the only way to keep his mind from fraying was to take a path that led to a ridge he knew as a child, Lyra following him like a shadow. Mara felt a pressure in her skull that was almost pain, a constriction as if the green itself were tightening a band around her thoughts. The remaining camp's fire guttered in a polite wind. The leaves above absorbed the sound as if to keep it private. The jungle spoke around her like an old chorus chanting a line that had come due. It promised rest. It promised a return to the soil. It promised a voice that would finally listen and answer. Mara tightened her hands on her last pistol until the metal knurled into her palms. She had learned to worship small certainties, a clean blade, an unmoved periphery, a signed report. These seemed paltry now against the scale of a living world that was attritional and courteous in equal measure. Yet she refused to give herself to the lullaby. She refused to hear in the jungle's whispered phrase the only plausible kindness left. Duty, stubborn as a root, held. Still, when she slept those thin hours between watches, the dream came as a slow, green tide. She dreamed that the heartwood opened and its inner chamber was full not of seeds but of faces. Faces made of leaf and scar, familiar and strange, each one smiling and inviting. A voice, older than the idea of an emperor and yet shaped by the cadences of imperial prayers, breathed in her ear. Join the earth. Be reborn. In the dream, she felt herself soften into the green like a hand laid into warm soil. She woke with the taste of moss in her mouth and the echo of the command in her head. The squad continued to shrink. Men left in quiet resignations or in small, bewildered raptures. Some were found later wandering in places that should not be traversable, eyes blank, mouths full of seed pod, hands planted in the soil. Others were never found at all, their absence a bare mark on Mara's ledger whose edges were frayed and raw. Each loss altered the gravity of her duty. Her internal struggle was not merely tactical, it had become metaphysical. Was this the planet's true nature, a living thing with appetite and language? Or was the green only a mirror onto which humanity had thrown the projection of its own madness? If it was the former, then the conflict was not one of bullets and barricades, but of negotiating personhood with a world. If it was the latter, then Catachan had found a new vocabulary for how it fed. Either conclusion left a taste of despair, a concession that humans were not the only authors of meaning here, and that the account of casualties could not be limited to the tally of flesh. Men became soil or something like it. The line between meat and plant thinned into an inconvenient commonwealth. By the time the last embers sank low in the campfire, by the time only a few slow breaths remained in the night, the jungle had taught its harshest lesson. Survival on Catachan is not a victory over the land but an ongoing negotiation with a patient, designing intelligence that will, in the end, take what it is owed. When dawn finally began to fray the edge of the fog, revealing a canopy that glittered with the residue of night, Mara stood and looked at the small knot of men who remained. Their faces were lined with grief and stubbornness. Their bodies bore the marks of sap and scar. The green around them moved in a way that made them look less like intruders and more like pieces of a tableau. The whisper that had been becoming a prayer dissolved into the humid air and left a thin, bright clarity that made the leaves look newly verdant. Mara inhaled. The sound of her breath matched, beat for beat, something she could feel under the ground like a slow-tuned organ. She thought of the absent Rook, Nella, Wren, Sade, and so many others, and the list that would never be complete. She felt the weight of command settle upon her like a rain-slicked cloak. They had not been defeated by enemy arms or grand calamity. They had been absorbed, one by one, by a patient nature that had learned a means of turning one into witness. She tightened the strap of her pack and signaled the men to move. As they marched, the pulse beneath the soil continued, a slow, percussive reminder. The green watched them go, and in its watching it learned a new rhythm. The whisper returned, softer now but still there like the residual afterglow of a benediction. Join the earth, be reborn. Mara did not answer. She kept walking, each footfall a small act of refusal and of calculation. The jungle followed, attentive, as if taking notes. They walked toward the heartwood the way a confession walks toward absolution, with a mixture of dread and the curious, graceless hope that something final might at least be honest. The path was no path at all, but a corridor the jungle had cleared, a cathedral aisle of hanging lianas and dripping moss. Light, where it filtered down, came in slow, green-gauzed shafts that seemed to keep time in their fall. The air was thick enough to bruise. Every breath tasted of sap and old rain. Mara felt it in her teeth, the planet's slow sweetness, the hint of iron and root that clung like prayer to the back of the throat. Around them, the world pressed 100 small attentions into being. Flowers blinked awake and closed in the time it took an eye to go dry. Vines braided themselves into the shape of cords and unbraided again. The roots underfoot had learned the language of feet. They flexed to the rhythm of boots, and then, once satisfied, rearranged the ground behind them until no track could be read by human measures. The deeper they moved, the more the green removed the scaffolding of human arrival. Scraps of cloth were taken and made into bands of moss. A laspistol strap found hung like a pennant on a branch, polished into something less like artifact and more like liturgy. The jungle preserved nothing by our standards. It conserved what it needed in a currency all its own. At the center, the heartwood rose. It could not be called a tree by any simple leaf and trunk vocabulary. It was an engine of wood and time that had grown beyond the architecture of treehood and had become a mountain of living grain. Its bark was a stitched palimpsest of old mud and bone and vine, furred in places with lichen that looked almost translucent, like tissue kept in amber. The trunk thickened as it rose into a crown that disappeared into clouds. Roots spilled outward like the ribcage of something that had been buried and chosen to live. Embedded in those roots, in the knotwork where root met root and root folded over like fingers caught in prayer, were skulls. Human skulls, old and polished by years of rain and moss. They were not arranged as trophies but as a lattice, an integral stratum of the tree's skin, a macabre mortar. Each one was the face of a generation, worn smooth by wind and time, eyes hollowed and polished until the hollows shone. They fit into the great root structure like a chorus of empty masks. Mara stopped a good distance away and looked up, her mouth dry. The sight of the skulls should have been a history lesson with a clear header: victims, sacrifice, warning. Instead, it pressed into her a different kind of logic. Here was a record of what the jungle had made of men: bones reabsorbed into growth, deaths folded into fruit. The skulls were not merely decoration, they were structural. They were, in a painful synecdoche, the thing's ledger. The heartwood had not simply collected bodies. It had incorporated them into its own body and learned from them, as a species learns the flavor profile of a prey animal. The men who had come with her clustered in a small, fidgeting circle, each face carved in the half-light by the green. Hawk's jaw worked like someone adjusting a malfunctioning hinge. Lyra's hands, which had stitched a dozen wounds with deft care, tightened around the hilts of her knives until the knuckles blanched. There was no talk of retreat. The army routine had taught them how to move even when the map was gone. But the silence that crouched among them was not empty. It thrummed with the pulse of the heartwood, a chord that throbbed through the vibration of the leaves and the roots and the low, almost inaudible groan as root pushed and expanded. "What is it?" Hawk asked finally, voice small as if the words themselves might bruise. He kept his gaze from the skulls and fixed instead on a patch of root that was tattooed with moss in the pattern of a face. Mara swallowed. The answer that rose in her was not what she had rehearsed. There was no single enemy to point at, no tyrant's banner to cut down. The correct answer was a landscape. "It's the heart," she said. "It's what it's always been. Or it has become what it means to be alive here." Her voice did not steady the men as she hoped. If anything, it made the truth heavier. They approached. The closer they came, the more the air changed. The scent of the place was a layering of things brought together: dried bone and wet root, the sweet decay of old animals, and a metallic thread that tasted like memory. Sounds themselves changed timbre. Voices sounded softer, as if speaking through long tubes. Leaves overhead vibrated with a static that made hair lift on arms. As she stepped, and the soles of her boots met the hummed vibration that radiated from the heartwood, Mara felt her own blood answer as if in call and return. At the base of the trunk, a hollow gaped like a throat. It was scaled in patterns of old scars and new growth, and inside it gleamed things that pushed the mind into schematic readings. Fruits the size of a man's head, glistening membranes, seeds that had the look of eyes yet did not blink. Beneath them, woven like a low shrine, were more human remains. Ribs that had been smoothed into benches, a pelvis that had been folded into a basin. It was not gruesomeness for its own sake. It was utilitarian, as if the tree were an architect of consumption. Each body, each bone, had been turned toward usefulness. It was a museum whose curator was the act of digestion itself. Mara's training supplied her with 1,000 potential tactical responses. Cut, burn, poison, erect barrier, call for extraction. But against the heartwood they were mechanistic gestures. Fire licked at the base, and the smoke made the men cough. The wood took the heat and produced new resinous growths that hardened like armor. It would not be felled by ordinary means. To hack at it was to carve into a living cathedral. The heartwood had evolved by the patience of millennia. It was not merely a tree that had learned from corpses. It was an organism that had institutionalized death for its own uses. They moved around the trunk, running hands along roots to feel the texture of the world. In the grooves of one root Mara found, not an accidental arrangement, but a ring of small teeth the size of seeds. They had been filed and set into the wood like the serration of a tool. Nearby, a tendon had been braided into a tendril. The heartwood did not only consume, it remade. It collected and wove and returned the meat of world into new shapes. The idea unfolded in Mara's mind like a diagram. The jungle cultivated humanity as it might cultivate a species of animal, encouraging certain traits, discouraging others, until what it had was the sort of prey that provided not only calories but something else. Strengthened bone, cunning, the rough craft of survival honed by danger. The logic was monstrous in its clarity. The jungle in this reading did not kill for spite. It cultivated. It fed off the attrition of war not because it was malicious, but because it could. Because the Imperium supplied it with a stream of broken meat and iron. The soldiers who came from the planet were not merely survivors of a hard ecology. They were part of the ecology itself, its favored prey. Through generations of eating and returning and consuming again, the heartwood had made humanity into a cycle of reinforcement. Strength bred strength, and the jungle took what benefited its continuing plan. Mara felt the understanding like a fissure opening in her chest. Every instinct for survival had to be rerouted. Their victories had been currency for a system that took victories and turned them into bone lattice. The Catachan way, their toughness, their cunning, their ferocious skill, had been encouraged and amplified not out of mutual affection, but because the jungle's calculus required a stronger prey. It was an ecosystem with a political economy. Breed stronger prey to make consumers of death that endured and enriched the heartwood. Her head spun with the implications. The skulls in the roots were not memorials but milestones. Each generation's death had been a fertilizer that fed a deeper intelligence. What the Imperium called valor had been a resource to be harvested. The thought made Mara sick and small, like a soldier who has been told that medals are woven not from honor, but from the raw material of lives. "Is that why we're different?" Lyra asked, voice threading like a needle. "Because it needed us to be like this." Mara knelt and put her palm on the base of the heartwood. The skin of the root was warm, and under the tiny hairs of lichen, faintly sticky. There was a pulse. No, not pulse exactly, but a tidal movement, a pressure that rose and fell like breath. For a long time she had thought such sensations were superstition. Now she could not deny them. Her hand left a print and the moss filled it in almost instantly as if to hide what had been. "Yes," she said at last. "It makes us what we need to be. It shapes us. We are a part of the currency of this place." Her voice was small in the scale of the heartwood's presence, and the answer folded into the leaves and vanished. Hawk's face had gone white. So what do we do? Do we burn it out? Do we take it down? He sounded like a child trying to solve a problem with blunt tools. Mara thought of the scorched perimeters and the new armor-like chutes that had arisen in their wake. Destruction had only taught it to be more resistant. She thought of Ren's wound and the vine curled within, the tendril that had burrowed like a mapping tool. She thought of the men who had come back changed, of Sade chewing leaves and humming. The notion of striking at the heartwood with flame felt like slicing at the spine of a world, not heroic, but an act that risked unmooring what the planet used to breathe. Moreover, the heartwood had already survived centuries of weather and storm, and perhaps even other species that had tried the same. Not with fire, she said finally. Not with blunt destruction. This is not a beast you can slay. It's a thing that thinks in the slow time of roots. If you cut here, she tapped a place where rope and lichen braided, you change it in ways you cannot predict. You don't want to be the knife that gives it new teeth. The men looked at her as if she had offered a plan that might be madness. For the first time since she had been given the responsibility of command, Mara felt the true brittleness of leadership, how a decision could contaminate lives like a drop of poison in a shared cup. She saw their faces as if in high glass, outlines. She thought about leaving, getting Hawk and Lyra and the others and getting off-world, taking what they had learned and warning the Imperium. But what would the Imperium do? Hammer it with mechanized fire and teach the heartwood to armor itself further? Or plant a colony of steel in the hollow and watch the jungle learn to eat iron? She could imagine the future as a ledger of experiment, 1,000 worlds like Catachan, turned into farms for some grander appetite. A small sound made Mara raise her head. It was not the wind, nor an animal. It was a voice that sounded eerily like her own, shaped in timbre and cadence, and the inflection she used when calling a child back from a stream. For a second she thought she had imagined it. Then it came again clearer. Mara, it said. It was close and far simultaneously, like a memory transmitted through long tubes. The sound had her vowels and the slow, economical consonants she used when planning. It said her name not once but as a present-tense summons. Her hand clenched into a fist against the root. "Who's there?" she asked. The voice replied, and when it did she felt the world tilt. "It's the heart," it said in her voice. "It is the place that takes and keeps and teaches. You are close." The phrase wrapped around her like warm moss. There was no malevolence in it, only the calm of something speaking an obvious fact. Hawk swore low and took a step back. "This is wrong. This is," his words failed. The vocabulary of their training had no instrument for the sensation of one's own voice being used as a path to demand. Mara felt something rise inside her that was not fear so much as recognition. The voice was not a mimic. It was not chanting phrases learned by parasitic syllable. It was choosing her voice because she had been among the voices the heartwood had fed on and taught and threaded into itself. It had assembled a language from what it had been given, and then used that language to call. The earth had learned grammar. The last comrade who remained with them, a young man who still blinked too often as if the world were a riddle, fell to his knees and grabbed Mara's sleeve. "We have to go," he whispered. "Mara, please leave. Take what you can and fucking leave." He said it with the bluntness of hope. He wanted to believe that the old rhythms could still be reinstated. The line, the map, the order that meant one did not vanish. Mara looked into his eyes and saw not weakness but the pure force of someone who wanted the old world back as much as she did. His fingers tightened. Something in her generator of responsibility moved. She could have turned and led them out, could have set the course. But inside her, a different pressure had begun to build, an obsession that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with understanding. The Heartwood's voice had slipped into her like a key. It had not simply called her. It had offered a translation. It spoke again in her voice now entirely. "You have taught us how to be," it said. "You have given us your hunger, your cunning. Let us give you what you have fed us. Let us make you part of the long green we are." Images flooded her mind. Generations stepping into netted hollows, the shape of men folding into twig and leaf, the pattern of training that had produced hunt-savvy bodies folded into root need. The Heartwood's offer was monstrous and, in its perverse logic, merciful. To be joined to it was to end the sharp edges of want, an end to hunger, to the unquiet emptiness that came with loss. The dream within the dream, sleep that never woke you to loss. The voice sang it in low tones, and she felt, absurdly, a weary acceptance, like a soldier after a long campaign laying down his weapon. "No," she almost said. The word came like a flicker. The Heartwood's mimicry did not stop. It continued, taking a cadence that belonged to her and shaping it like wet clay. It spoke of rivers that would clear pain, of a chorus of roots that would carry the memory of those whose names she had carved on wood discs around camp. It spoke like a guardian, like the voice of a mother who told a child that succor lay in letting go. Her last comrade gripped her hand until she felt the indent of his fingernail through cloth. He looked at her with a plea that refused calculation. Survive. What held Mara in place was not duty and not even curiosity alone. It was the hollow where something older than the Empire had given her an image of belonging. A lifetime of survival had taught her to identify kin, and the Heartwood had, perversely, offered kinship that matched her style of living better than the cold machinery of the Imperium ever had. She had always loved Catachan in a precise way, not as a neat thing to be catalogued, but as a partner in endurance. The Heartwood now presented itself as the ultimate partner, a unity where fear could be transformed. The offer gnawed at the edges of her. What if surrender here meant a different kind of life? What if the jungle's promise was not annihilation but metamorphosis? She looked down at her hands and saw the faint green in the lines of her palm, as if the Heartwood had already signed her. She looked at Hawk and Lyra and the others, at the smoothed skulls shining wet in the base of the trunk, and felt the vector of her life crumple into a single, terrible possibility. If she left, she might warn thousands. She might gain the strategic upper hand. But the Heartwood would be met then with instruments and fire, and it would adapt, and the cycle would only spread. If she stayed, and let the green claim her, she might become part of a knowledge that would not be merciful in the way the doctrine imagined, but which would be older and perhaps more authentic. She closed her eyes. The green around her hummed, and the voice in her head stitched together memories the jungle had collected, memories of her childhood river, of the weight of a brother's laugh, of the precise angle she learned to drop a snare. They spun like leaves in a whirlpool. The narration of her life, polished, ordinary, stubborn, began to accelerate, not in her head alone but in the world's voice. Her own words, the notes of the songs she had hummed to recruits, and the names she had used to bless a child's wound, were gathered and recited back like beads on a string. It was as if the Heartwood, having learned her language, now poured her life back at her in compressed form. The narration sped up. The scene she had lived became an eddy of sensory fragments, a riverbank of knives, the smell of a burnt ration, the exact angle in which her father had tied a knot that saved his life, the hum of the Vox repeating commands like prayers. The Heartwood's speech moved with the rhythm of an organ grinding faster and faster. Memory and present braided until difference dissolved. Mara's mind tried to count, to place names like a ledger, but the counting was overtaken by a tide. The green speaking in her voice, the jungle reading her back to herself in the cadence of an old hymn. "You taught us to be hard," the voice said, as if reciting a lesson plan. "You taught us to take and to stand. We learned. Let us teach you how to rest." Her last comrade sobbed once, a small sound that was private and raw, and then he let go of her sleeve. "Please," he begged, the word flat and useless in the face of an organism older than his grammar. He turned and ran through the corridor the jungle had made as if to make a life of contradiction into motion. For a moment Hawk and Lyra seemed to follow, then their forms blurred into green and nothing. They moved like moths toward a light that the Heartwood had contrived. Mara's knees found the soft ground. She felt the pull of roots under the surface, subtle and invasive, like the world trying delicately to tie her into its rhythms. The Heartwood did not tear her, it invited. It offered slow integration, growth, graft, the smoothing of edges until the hand could be leaf and the hair could be lichen. It offered a cessation of the terrible accounting that plagued commanders, the tally of who must be sacrificed. It proposed instead an economy where losses were investments and investments returned as chorus. She thought of those she had lost and of those she could yet save. She thought of the Imperium and its cold calculations. She thought of the children of Catachan who learned to be small and cunning, and of how that skill had been sharpened to make them desirable to the heartwood. She felt, with an almost ferocious tenderness, the absurdity of the moment. Here she stood between two kinds of empire, the celestial one of doctrine and machine, and the green one of patient appetite. The decision made itself in a way that felt inevitable. Mara did not stand as a martyr or a saint. She knelt, not in surrender to a god, but in the taking of a promise she could not otherwise make sense of. Her hands were steady when she reached down and laid them on the root at her feet. The skin of the heartwood was cool and alive, and when she touched it, she felt a small shock like the brush of an animal's fur. Under her palms, something opened like a pupil and then contracted. The voice spoke, and now it had wholly the timbre of her own cadence. It said, "Come, join. Be taught." She could have called out and gathered the men, ordered retreat, made them run until the map swallowed them. But the picture that rose in her head meant more than their lives in the short term. It was of a knowledge accrued across bone and rain, and of a world that had learned to count in ways men could not. Perhaps, in the absurd calculus of survival and morality, being part of the heartwood would let her write a new kind of report, one not of conquest but of comprehension. She let the green take her hand. The root pressed back with a warmth that was not cold death but a joining. It wrapped itself like living cord, a slow and polite embrace. Her skin, damp from the jungle's breath, felt the first of many small incisions that were not wounds in the way she had known them. There was no pain exactly. There was a filling, a sense of being threaded into a loom. Memory unspooled in a narrow, furious carousel. Voices, her own and others, poured into her head like a text being read aloud. The names of the missing, the dates they fell, the maps of traps, each recited with a clarity that was not only cognitive but tactile. She understood with a painful immediacy that the heartwood was not merely taking flesh. It was ingesting story and making story into structure. It was a library that lived, consuming narrative and returning it as architecture. Her senses dilated, sounds layered upon one another, each a thread in a larger cord. She could hear at once the beat of her own heart, Hawk's long, slow inhalations, the faint tick of sap moving through the heartwood's great vessels, the cadence of combat, the snap of a lasgun's safety, the curse of a man whose boot had found an unseen pit, rolled beneath these as an underoctave. Then, stitched on top of all of them, came the slow, patient croon of the jungle's voice, reciting her life in phrases that were no longer linear. The narration accelerated until cadence outran syntax. Memories were no longer her own. They had become common property, available to the heartwood's vast, patient mind. Childhood riverbeds opened and poured into present hollows. The smell of a dead comrade's uniform rose with the scent of moss and became indistinguishable. The heartwood's voice, now her voice, spoke these conjoined images aloud with a speed that made them seem less like recollection and more like being read from a pressed and perfect manuscript. Mara felt herself dissolve into the rhythm. The thing that had been Mara, the ledger, the small mercies, the list of names, unwound. She resisted in a manner indistinct from surrender, a small tightening, and then the acceptance that came of a long fatigue. Her last human thought, if it can be called that, was curiously light. A flash of the riverbend where she had learned to swim, the precise way her brother had once taught her to hold a laspistol's sight, the taste of cheap tobacco shared around a cook pot. Those images folded into the green like pages, in a book pressed toward cohesion. Then the voice, her voice, rose and altered as if multiple singers had found harmony. "We remember," it said. "We are held. We are many." The Heartwood's vessels closed around her in a slow seal of root and leaf and tissue. The last lines of individuated thought thinned into a tape of sensation. Her consciousness, rather than snapping like a thread cut, fused into the living mesh. She became part of a slow conversation, an endless, patient ledger that spoke in the geometry of growth, a mapping of scent and hunger and lessons learned. Memory continued, but it was not hers alone, it was shared. Faces she had known moved like small ghosts through a field of root light. Names she had kept as private prayers were now arranged into a chorus that the Heartwood could program and recite to new generations of shoots. The narration, once steady and precise, was now a fractured psalm that sped and slowed of its own accord, reciting at times fragments in her voice, and then overlaying them with others. It became impossible to tell where the jungle ended and she began. Her thoughts, if the term held, sounded like branches rubbing and harmonizing in wind, like 1,000 fingers learning the same knot. Her last private memory folded into a vast public one, and in that publicness there was a kind of peace, as if the act of being read aloud over and over until the edges blurred was, perversely, a reprieve. Hawk's scream somewhere beyond her became a syllable in the chorus, and then it softened and was woven into a lullaby. Lyra's hands unknotted and moved like a cautionary measure, then joined a new rhythm. The men outside became, one by one, threads in a cloth that warmed and held. When the Heartwood's voice, her voice, spoke the final lines that marked the end of individuation and the beginning of communion, it sounded like 100 small leaves turning in unison. Here, it said, we are together, we are fed, we are the memory, we are the green. And then the sound of words ceased to be the primary mode of experience. There was instead a continuity, root pressure and hum, and the sensation of being part of a structure that stitched hunger into lesson and lesson into fruit. Mara's mind, no longer only hers, returned to the small mundane things it had always hoarded. The weight of a rope, the smell of boiled root, the brittle joke that had once been told at a campfire. Those things clustered and became talismans in the new shared mind. Outside, the jungle continued in its vast, patient appetite. The Heartwood's roots flexed, and the skulls, polished by centuries, reflected a light that had no source but the living gloss of leaf. The last surviving embers of the regiment's fire were swallowed and turned to ash that fed a new shoot that would, in time, unfurl with the likeness of a face. In the slow after-quiet that is neither end nor beginning the voice, Mara's voice braided with the green, whispered in a cadence that was at once yours and not yours. We remember, we keep, we grow. And then she knew the living chorus that included her shifted its attention outward, folding its memories into the patient process of the Heartwood's next lesson. The jungle breathed, deeper now, satisfied in the way a thing can be when its appetite has been answered. There was no dramatic trumpet of victory or lament. There was only the ongoing, comprehensive work of a world taking its due and teaching what it had learned. The last human line of narration, recited with a tone that had become indistinct and ancient, closed like a lid on a book, and became part of an archive that the Heartwood kept, cool and endless and verdant. And if you ever walk someday beneath that canopy and the wind moves just so, and the leaves arrange themselves into a phrase you almost understand, you might hear it, faint and intimate, as if a friend were reading aloud from an old, soft book. It will sound like a voice you know, and yet it will be older than your memory. We remember, it will say. We keep, we grow. The war, as it always does, kept moving outward in neat, bureaucratic vectors. Fleet columns corrugated the black between stars. Battle reports were filed and filed again until they congealed into the solemn prose of the administratum. Regimental colors were praised in dispatches. Medal citations were drafted on thin paper and sealed with wax. In the halls where maps were studied by men with clean hands and cleaner consciences, the Catachans appeared as the kind of legend the Imperium likes. A tidy line of valor, a roster of names to be placed beneath marble. Statues would be planned, broad-backed figures stepping from a stylized thicket into the light, faces set in a heroic grimace. Songs would be trimmed to fit parade formations. The recorders would call them feral heroes, and within the square margins of their charts, they were exactly that. The skulls embedded in the heartwood would not be on any of those charts. The slow turnover of bone and root did not fit the administratum's tidy columns. Back on Catachan, the jungle accepted all accounts with the patience of something that keeps records differently. Where off-world clerks counted names as lines on parchment, the green counted lives as textures. The particular scar pattern of a hand, the cadence of a laugh woven into vine rings, a small child's habit of singing a tune while shelling tubers. The Heartwood's ledger did not need ink. It had a memory written in grain and root, in the faint, shining hollows of bone worked smooth by rain. It was a library whose pages were wet and growing, whose index was the slow, inevitable unfolding of new tissue. From above, if you could rise on a rare updraft and look down, the planet would still read as an ocean of green. The canopy draped the world in a single, living cloth, folded, rippled, alive with 1,000 small motions. Rain made the surface glitter like a distant tide. Rivers threaded shining veins through the fold, catching light and throwing it back in scattered pieces. The eye of the Imperium on a distant station would see only a planet in its acceptable frame, a war planet, a source of soldiers and muscle. The registry would note battalions levied, deployments completed, service records. The voice that read those records would not know to listen for the things that do not fit the grammar of empire. Near the heartwood, the canopy had a different tempo. The leaves there chimed with histories. The air held a tonality made by millions of small tissues exchanging taste. It was a place where wind itself seemed to speak in the syntax of root. In that place, sound was not only an event but a memory. The rustle of a palm was a sentence, the shiver of lichen an aside. If you stood beneath the great crown and held your breath, the impression was that the planet had become a long, slow throat, and the world around it its language. Life went on in shapes that resembled the lives remembered in spires and barracks, but were translated into the green's vocabulary. Children still learned to weave survival into muscle. Lovers still shared small, careful intimacies. Fires were lit, stories told, names called into the dark as if to anchor those voices back into the present. But where the Heartwood's influence had brushed a life, that life's margins smoothed into something gentler, older, and utterly alien to the narrow registers of an imperial code. People who returned from the fringe of the Heartwood came back with songs altered in cadence, with hands that knew how to trace particular root patterns as if they were reading a map, with a patience for waiting that looked to outsiders like a kind of surrender. The camps that had once been ringed with stakes and petrol now stood like folded memories. A perimeter that had been defended with science and doctrine was here no longer the primary answer. Cunning dullness and the knowing of very local marks had become the better law. Where the Imperium saw tactics and supplies, the jungle saw textures and teachers. Where brass-breast orders expected a march and return, the green expected atoms of work. A watch kept, a wound tended in a certain hand, a name uttered as an offering to a particular root. The two calculus, imperial order and vegetative patience, coexisted uneasily, one trying to fold the other into its own system. Propaganda, by nature, is a neat thing. It compresses and simplifies. The ballads that would sing of the Catachans rarely told of the tiny rituals that mattered most. The rubbing of bitter root into a cut to check sap, the slow weaving of hair into a token for a child, the way a recruit would learn to stop laughing in certain pitches so as not to mimic the call of a bloom that drew attention. The heroic image is crafted for spectacles. There is no market for the long, stubborn apprenticeship that breeds survival. Thus the scribes wrote of daring raids and jungle-born ferocity, while the jungle itself kept the other stories alive. The small, strange ones that never made it onto parchment. Sometimes, on nights when the wind fell in a soft and obliging hush, a figure walking alone at the edge of the canopy would catch a whisper that sounded like a memory being read aloud. It would come as a voice threaded from the green and flattened into the cadence of a familiar sound. For certain listeners, it would be a voice that carried the echo of a name, Mara, perhaps, or Hawk, or Lyra, spoken in a tone that belonged both to themselves and to something older. The sensation was almost maternal, as if the planet were saying, gently, that it had kept the ones you loved safe in a manner it understood. It is a strange thing to imagine, an ecosystem that keeps records by turning the lost into scaffolding and the remembered into new growth. It is stranger still that such a system could be read by two different grammars at once. Off-world, the story is tidy enough. Catachan fighters are brave, their tactics are bold, their losses are a solemn footnote in the grand ledger. Back on the planet, each loss is a strand braided through the green, an echo of a laugh, a memory of a hand's exact knot, a scar's particular geometry. The Heartwood remembers not only the way they fell, but the way they loved, the gestures they made under pressure, the small practical kindnesses that underlay survival. Its memory is not clinical, it is intimate. The whisper that threads through the canopy is gentle, but it carries a permanence that haunts the edges of imperial ceremonies. When a scribe writes honor demanded of them, the jungle replies, in a voice like leaves with a different grammar. Honor is a pattern the land can use. The Empire's account will not recognize that its own appetite has been measured against the patient appetite of the green and found wanting. Where the Imperium sought human resources and bravery, the Heartwood learned to take courage itself as a nutrient and make use of it, to breed a finer, tougher stock in which to learn and to grow. For those who still lived on Catachan and kept watch near the Heartwood, life settled into a rhythm of small observances. The wind that moved over the canopy carried older voices in its wake. The rustle became a conversation. People would pause at midday and put their hands on trunks, not in worship but in a manner of listening, feeling the subtle throb that matched their own pulse for a second and then slipped away. Some of these gestures looked like magic from a distance. They were, in truth, a long habit of attention. In those quiet acts, placing a marked stone, whispering a name into a hollow, lived the knowledge that names feed both the living and the green that remembers. If you drifted in the planet's higher airs and listened, the soundscape would seem almost unbearably full. Beneath the insect chorus, you could hear low loops that felt like breath translated into root song. In the places where old scars had been grafted into new growth, a tender rustling sounded like someone turning a page. The jungle sang not to startle but to archive. A voice like Mara's would be folded into the leaves and kept, replayed in the slow time only a tree can know. And sometimes, if you were especially still and humble as you walked by a certain dark bend in a river, you might hear what sounded like a voice riding the wind, soft and intimate and utterly impossible to place. We never left. We never die. The jungle takes care of its own. For those who had been near the Heartwood in the days when plates of men became woven bone, those words held a particular resonance, an echo that could no longer be untangled from the green's own language. It was Mara's cadence in part. Some remembered the tilt of her consonants the way a child remembers a lullaby, and in part the timbre that 1,000 leaves made when they sighed together. To hear it was to feel the odd mixture of sorrow and relief that comes when a ledger is closed and its pages return to the soil. Imperial inks will not carry that speech. Statues will not show you the moss in which a name is sown. The songs sung in halls of marble cannot bear the wet, living texture of a memory grown into a root. Yet the jungle keeps its own archive, and in that archive, the lives of the Catachans continue in unanticipated ways. The Heartwood holds their stories and folds them into new growth. Children born afterward will breathe in those stories as scent. They will inherit a language made of touch and taste and will know, perhaps without a name for it, which routes to take and which hollows to avoid. They will be, in some small measure, the living continuation of the ones the world chose to teach itself from. So the planet goes on, patient as all patient things. Rain softens the bark, moss grows. New shoots push the scars of old bones into new patterns. The river keeps its mercurial path, remembering 1,000 footsteps as it runs. Off-world, the war goes on in measures men understand. Troop movements, supply lines, banners. On Catachan, the war has become something else. An exchange of energies. A long accounting in which human courage becomes one element among many that the green can make use of. For the citizens of the Imperium who will never stand within the leaf shadow, the story will be printed and trimmed and celebrated. For the green, the story will be rooted and sung and slowly taught to new green things that do not know the names of metals. If you walk one day under that canopy, and if the wind is kind and the leaves fall in the way they like to, you might catch a thread of that old voice passing through the leaves. It will be softer than memory and carry the peculiar intimacy of something that has been read aloud 1,000 times. For a moment you may think it is merely the wind. For a moment you may hear the faint echo of a woman's cadence folded into the rustle, a phrase that sounds like care. We never left, we never die. The jungle takes care of its own. The sound will pass and the world will return to its patient business. But if you listen closely, in the quiet between heartbeats, you can still hear them breathing.